Hi, this is John Willison, the Director of the BTeach Middle Years program, and this video is for everyone enrolled in the BTeach secondary and middle for when you go on your professional placement. It's particularly to help you make observations that give you deep insights into student learning and to your own professional practice. When you're on professional placement, you'll find that there's a lot going on in the classroom and it's very hard to know exactly what to focus in on. So what we're going to go through now is a way of looking and thinking about what's happening. So the Models of Engaged Learning Teaching, or MELT for short, provides a way to look at quite sophisticated and complex learning, whether it's in literature context or laboratory or home economics or PE, and language learning, any contexts. So the version I'm going to show you is a pentagon shape. This was made by students for students, and it's got, like a gem, 6 facets that sparkle and shine, 6 different ways of understanding our thinking, understanding sophisticated learning. Because what MELT can do is provide us with a beautiful insight into classroom learning activities, and that could be both the teacher's planning of those, but the students' engagement in those and their sophisticated thinking. It also, MELT can be used very much for formative assessment, for the way students engage with those 6 facets of thinking and giving them feedback on that so they know what's working well and what is a bit more problematic. And could also use to shape summative assessments, and if students are familiar with the formative assessment, then they could also engage in more rich and sophisticated ways for the summative assessment if it shares the same 6 facets. So to go through the first facet of MELT is all about what is our purpose? What are we trying to achieve? It uses verbs to embark and clarify, to push off and to work out exactly where we're going. This facet has many different ways of being achieved, but it also has some elements, as Einstein found. I have no special talents. I'm only passionately curious. And what we really want is students to get their teeth into things and be very much drawn into elements where there might be curiosity or passion or intrigue, and not to be the opposite, which is to be potentially disengaged. So some of the specifics of that, for example, can be around asking a question. It could be a research question, state a hypothesis, frame a project aim, identify a problem. You might be immersed in readings or videos. You might be stories or narratives, novels. You might formulate something like a thesis statement, or you might propose an action and say, let's kick off, let's get started, and then work out what we're doing and then try to fine tune it and clarify it as we go. And often embarking and clarifying is well served by the idea of the students who made the pentagon with this in the center. They said, when in doubt, return to the center. What are you really trying to achieve? And clarify that. So after we have become clear in our own learning or our teaching, or for students' learning, then we need to consider the question, what do we need? We need to find information or generate data. And for Einstein, he said, I'll not give up on a problem until I found one proper solution. And he was determined to keep going. So that's what we want in learning, that students are not slapdash, but find systematic processes, so they have methods to find others' information or generate data, whether qualitative, like interview data, or quantitative, like lab-based data and measurements. Once we have a sense of addressing what we need in terms of information and data, then we have to answer the question, what do we trust? And this is the very evaluative question. We have to think of being discerning, weighing up the value of information. So Einstein said, I think for months, for years, 99 times the conclusion is false. The 100th time I'm right. And this sense of, in the information age, there's so much information for us and our students, but we have to really get rid of a lot of the stuff that's low in trustworthiness, low in credibility. And that's such a pertinent thing for modern education in the era of fake news. We have to work out what is trustworthy and keep it. We have to reflect on our own learning processes and see how we could improve things, reduce bias. Absolutely vital facet in teaching and learning. Then we have to consider, how do we take trustworthy information, credible data, and how do we arrange it in ways where we could start to do some of the big picture things, like see what's going on. So we want to organise things in ways that are appropriate for the data, whether it's qualitative or quantitative. If it's quantitative, we might have graphs and tables, and we have to think of what type of graph, and what different subject areas have different ways of doing that. In text, whether we're going to have a structure of an essay or a structure of a report or bullet points or note form. But what we're trying to do in all this, as Einstein said, out of clutter, find simplicity. From discord, in harmony. And so that whole sense of trying to take the information data and bring harmony to understand what's going on, but also for the management processes, when there's time, resources, teams, processes to follow, we want to have this harmonious sense so that both, and when you're looking in the classroom, you have to look out for the way that teachers are managing the environment, how they're getting the students to organise information, but what are the students doing in self-organisation or self-management, or just following the teacher's instruction? How effectively is that working? So when we have well-organised information, we can start to ask, what does it mean? Because we can start to see the themes in the qualitative data. We can start to see the trends because of that organisation helps us to do the analysis. And often we go from analysis back and reorganise and back and forth. But the analysis is seeing what's going on, getting down into the minute details. Might be grammatical analysis or analysis of the subparticles of atomic nuclei. It also involves the synthesis, putting all the bits together into the whole and seeing the big picture of what it means. And as Einstein said, knowledge is limited, but creativity circles the earth. And he used a lot of creative processes, which wasn't just out of the blue ideas, but also building on a knowledge base and synthesizing things and letting that creativity emerge from that. Absolutely one of the big facets for education, because that's part of our purpose. So the students know what it means. They're creating an understanding, something that, like the little child there singing, understand, does it match what I know? And that's what we're after, that deep understanding for students. Then finally, we're left with the question of how do we relate? It's all about communication and application. And this is where communication can be oral or written or body language, it can be through videos or live. It's surely like products like essays and stage performances, oral presentations, but more than that, it's the processes, it's all the communications throughout, all the practice, all the rehearsal, all the drafts, but all the talking between people and teams and teachers. The communication is a process. And as to is application, it's not just that end-on application, but applying what I currently know to this problem, applying what I'm just learning to the next issue and working out what has to happen in the future. And we're primarily after students who are constructive, they'll build up and not be self-serving or lazy, but actually build. And so with those 6 facets, we're going to look and hear about a specific classroom situation and see how those 6 facets of MELT are, apply to that classroom situation. So to help you practice using MELT for classroom observations, I'm going to talk you through a classroom observation that I made a while ago. And I was in a Year 8 science class, but it really doesn't matter which subject or context that you might be observing. I'll just talk you through this context, which was students, as you'll see, were issued with a challenge to pass a steel ball through a steel ring, and to use a Bunsen burner to help them do that. The ball didn't fit through the hole in the ring, but their challenge was to make it fit. So that's the scenario that I was observing. And once we've gone through that story, then we'll use MELT for the analysis. So the story is called Shrink. By the time I sit behind Tara and Shannon on the experimental bench that runs alongside the rear wall, Mrs. Stewbaum is already talking to the class. What you're trying to do is put the ball through the hoop. You need to be careful because you could burn yourself. Decide what to heat, the ball or the ring. You have to push it through the ring. Tara collects the equipment and sits down next to Shannon at their lab bench. They light the Bunsen and start heating the ring. Soon Tara lowers the ball through the hole in the ring and says, "We did it!" She looks very satisfied at their success. Suddenly, Mrs. Stewbaum calls out, "Okay, everyone, pack your equipment away. Write down the equipment and tell me what happened to your ball and ring." I return to Tara and ask her, "What was your prediction?" "Metal would burn and shrink, and that's what happened. It shrinks to let the ball through." I'm caught by a surprise, but Shannon rescues me. "No, it doesn't. It expands." "No, the ring shrinks," retorts Tara. "It expands. It shrinks because the ring becomes thinner and thinner until the ball gets through," explained Tara, getting extremely frustrated with Shannon's thinking. And so their observation of the ball and the ring was the same. They heated the ring and the ball fell through. But their actual interpretation of that was completely different. And it's as classroom observer that you get to hear some of these stories and dialogue and phenomena and the way students see things and understand things and talk together. And sometimes in observation you'll be talking to people too. So let's see how the story continued. Shannon is also annoyed with Tara and retaliates, "The hole has to get bigger to let the ball through, so the middle must expand." Tara and Shannon call her Mrs. Stewbaum, but the conversation goes around in similar circles. Returning to the front, Mrs. Stewbaum asks the class, "What happened to the solid when it's heated?" "Expands," someone calls out. Mrs. Stewbaum nods in confirmation. Shannon whispers to Tara, "I told you." Tara sits quietly, looking annoyed. I return to her and try to understand her point, and she continues her explanation. "I mean, it shrinks outwards, like the metal inside shrinks towards the outside." "You're saying the actual metal bit gets smaller?" I probe. Tara nods. "What actually happens is the metal expands and moves out." I explain. "I told you," triumphs Shannon again. Tara grows even more frustrated, but presses on. "The outside expands to give the inside room to shrink. See, I said this is stupid because you don't know if you're right." So we look at the story of Tara and Shannon. In Shrink, we can see each of the facets of MELT come out. So with Embark and Clarify, the first thing is that the teacher set them a task to get the ball through the metal ring. And so that was the sense of purpose the teacher gave to the students, set a challenge actually. And the students took up that challenge and saw that as their purpose, at least Shannon and Tara did, not necessarily all the other students. And you could say that they successfully took up that challenge. It was pretty straightforward. You just heat the metal ring. But of course, there was a lot more to the teacher's intention and also the student's purpose than that in terms of what they were actually doing. So over time, they started to grapple with teachers' deeper intentions, which is about the nature of metals when you heat them. And of course, the students started to really think through those issues and started to come up with their own, you could say, hypotheses, even though they were very simple, but there was actually two different hypotheses. One from Shannon saying metals expand when you heat them, and from Tara saying metals shrink when you heat them. And so this is a situation where the students have moved from like a given purpose and starting to actually formulate their own hypotheses, which of course they could in the future test. So much is going on for Embark and Clarify. They also had to find information. So they did actually have some information from the teacher. They had to find what was relevant, like what they had to actually do. And that included finding equipment. They had to get their Bunsen burner out, go up the front and get a ball and ring, and they had to actually generate data. In this case, it was observation data, where for a start, the ball wouldn't pass through the ring, and they could feel that actually, because the ball was actually sit on top and stuck. They could see that. In some ways, they could hear that if they wanted to generate that sort of observation data. And then, of course, after they heated the ring, then they had more data, which was the actual ball pass through the hole in the metal ring. And that was very, very important data for what they were really trying to achieve. But they needed that data. They could have generated more data, like what happened when the ring cooled down. Did the hole in the ring stay large and the ball could still pass through, or etc. And other data could have been what happened if you hit the ball instead of the ring, what would happen? So there's even a lot going on around find and generate. Now, for evaluate and reflect, the students have to think about, first they were issued with a challenge, so they have to think, well, first of all, we're going to heat something, we've got a Bunsen burner, and so they had to really think, do they do both together, the ball and the ring, because the ball could sit on the ring, or do they do one or the other? And so they're tossing up those sort of ideas. And of course, they celebrate the success, we did it, and they realise that they satisfactorily lived up to the challenge the teacher set. And so that was just a very simple evaluation, because it kind of, the ball did go through the ring, and so that data said success. But then they started to move into a sense of deeper evaluation around weighing up the information and seeing what they could trust, what they could see as being relevant. And so that led really onto the analysis and synthesis exactly. But I'm going to just talk about organise and manage first. So for organise and manage, to get this whole process going, they had a certain amount of time. The teacher was calling for them to pack up after not that much period of time in the story. They had to manage equipment. They had to manage, did they have safety equipment? Do they have lab coats? Do they have safety goggles on? How do they manage the gas and the matches? Did they use a safety flame? Because in science there is a certain colour safety flame when they're not heating. How did they go with their team? Because they actually started kind of competing ideas and started kind of arguing. Not that that's necessarily bad, because they might have been thinking about each other's ideas. But as a team, how functional were they? Were they organising their data
into their lab books, getting down those observations and organising other elements of communication. So the organise and manage elements, as always, are huge. And the teacher, of course, had substantial management elements in the whole class environment throughout that lab. Now, I just mentioned that before, analyse and synthesise, because often there's times that it's the way you organise credible data that really lends itself to analysis, as I said earlier. But in this case, the analysis was based on very simple observation data that they were primarily discussing. They had it organised in their own minds. But the analysis was, why did the whole get bigger? It really focused in on that. And for Shannon, it was because the metal expands and it's expanding outwards. But for Tara, that analysis didn't make sense, because if the metal expands, then you get a hole that would be smaller. Like in railway tracks, when the metal expands, the gap between the railway tracks gets smaller. So if something expands, there's less hole, more thing. So it didn't make sense to Tara at all. And so their synthesis was striving for understanding, and you get this big sense of frustration as Tara is really becoming more and more sure that her analysis and synthesis is correct, that metals must shrink when you heat them. And of course Shannon's the opposite. She's very adamant that metals must expand when you heat them, in agreement with the rest of the class. And of course Shannon's in agreement with the rest of the class, and that's confirmed. But Tara is feeling very frustrated, and that leads her to do a major evaluation of the whole situation based on her analysis and synthesis. So she goes back to evaluate, and you could say reflect, and she says, see, I said this is stupid because you don't know if you're right. And so that is how often analysis and synthesis actually play back and forth between things like evaluation, and also fit in to organise and manage. And that's because there's a lot of fluidity between these different facets. And so when you're watching actual classes, you might at times think, well, is that one facet or another? And you just have to make some decisions and think, where does it fit best? But just one thing to say about the distinction between analysis and evaluation, whilst they do have significant overlap at times, but evaluative thinking is pretty much weighing up and thinking about the value and credibility of something, whereas analysis is primarily getting to the root cause and the deep meanings of something. So they actually have quite a different sense in the end, even though they have some overlap. So with analysis and synthesis, the thing that sets people up to do is really to communicate and apply. And there was communication at the end about when Mrs. Stewbaum asks what happens, and there's actually calling out from the class that, well, Mrs. Stewbaum says, what happens to the solid when it's heated? And expands, someone calls out. And that kind of communication of that substantial understanding comes out in words, and Mrs. Stewbaum also ended up writing that on the board. But poor Tara is left feeling that she doesn't want to communicate except to Shannon that this is stupid. But so they're both applying their current and prior knowledge actually to the situation. So it's not just random that Shannon thinks expand and Tara thinks shrink. There's a whole lot of background in each individual learner that heavily influences classroom dynamic and understanding in any discipline, any subject, any context. Prior knowledge is the way that students view phenomena, And even though for many people it's clear that metals must expand when heated when doing this experiment, prior knowledge determines if that's the way people see it. And that is the case when people are reading novels in English or poems. It's how they're interpreting history is all influenced by a lot of prior things. And the way they apply their knowledge to this current task, the way they apply understandings to the next task or to the future is all around communicate and apply. But these are processes that happen from beginning to end, not at the end. And so you've got students who are talking together. The teacher, Mrs. Stubbaum, explaining to the class and using diagrams and text and equipment, and a lot of different forms of visual, spoken, written communication throughout. And same way, application of ideas and of equipment, putting them into putting equipment like Bunsen burner and processes into practice, the application, all the way through. So these are the 6 facets of MELT, and you could see that they do relate to this quite common scenario in science. You can apply this to a number of different subject areas. If you see fit, you might find another observation lens to look through. But MELT, as we said earlier, gives you a way to really think about kind of the learning activities that are going on and to get a rich window into students' thinking. Also, if there's a formative assessment that really focuses a lot on giving students feedback and changing their performance, or even sometimes summative assessment, you can get a handle on from lens. A handle on using MELT as a lens. So hopefully you have a wonderful observation experience. We already said the classroom environment is very complex unless you focus in. So I think this is an amazing opportunity for you, because it's very rare you get a chance just to be there and watch, and you'll interact with students, but not in a way you're quite about to teach them. You might do a little bit of tutoring with students quietly and with 1 or 2, but you generally don't have the pressures of teaching in your first observation-based professional placement. So make the most of this opportunity, because it might never be the same. Like in second year, you'll have more pressures to think more directly about teaching, and you'll be in different contexts. So use this context to do some amazing observations. You could use MELT to structure that, as we've said. You could use it visually, or you could use it as a list. The idea of MELT is that it's fluid. You don't have to use exactly those verbs. They should be often adapted to your context. So whether you've got a research question or an immersion or a hypothesis or a thesis statement, all those are very appropriate. Think of the questions, like what is my purpose, what do we need, and do some dynamic observations for your classroom. This could be a really good set of observations for your portfolio that Walter and Chido will guide you through later on, and towards you'll be seeing for semester 2 for your portfolio. That'll be important for your professional practice. So I wish you all the best. Now you might be interested about the cartoonist Aaron Humphrey, who's actually here at University of Adelaide in School of Media, the discipline of media. He did his PhD on cartoons in education. Absolutely brilliant. So I thank Aaron very much for his cartooning work. And you can go to melt.edu.au if you want to see this cartoon's available and various resources. And we've got the more established website is www.rsd.edu.au. But it's the MELT one that has got a lot more of the school-based resources, and it's in development. We're still working on it. A lot more stuff to put up there. So all the best, and I look forward to hearing some great things from the professional placement.